This is the oral history of James J. Duratz. For 30 years, the general manager of the Meadville Master Antenna System in Meadsville, Pennsylvania. Jim is also a cable television pioneer, both with the capital P and with a small p, and is a founder. It was just an honorary title held by Jim in the Pennsylvania Cable and Telecommunications Association. Jim is in his tenure at Meadville Master, was the early developer of many things, including an extensive local programming operation from a local cable standpoint. The date is August 3rd, 2001. The place is Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, at the annual meeting of the Pennsylvania Cable and Telecommunications Association's Heritage Society meeting. Welcome, Jim. Jim, to start off with, tell us a little bit about your background prior to getting into cable television.
Wait, right from the beginning?
Right from the beginning.
No.
No, once you got out of service.
When I got out of the service, I had 4 years in the service. And
Infantryman, is that right?
Yeah, in the infantry. Just served the South Pacific and Germany. But after I got out of the service, it's something I'd wanted to do all my life, and that was to be a Pennsylvania State Policeman. And I did that. And it was I was very proud to have been one. But after I was there for a while, I decided I didn't want to make that my career. I went through the academy, and I guess that satisfied me more than anything. But but I can say that probably was what eventually got me into cable television. It's hard to imagine that, but it's true. Because I was stationed in Greensburg, Pennsylvania, which was a Squadron 1 headquarters. And from Greensburg, I was transferred to Erie, and that was Troop E, the Pennsylvania State Police, and Meadville was a substation of Troop E. They had 5 substations, and Erie was the headquarters. And there were 9 of us, and alphabetically I was first. And they needed somebody to go to Meadville to replace the guy who was going on vacation, so that was me. And when I went there, everybody said, "You better hope you don't go to Meadville. It's a really tough place." And it turned out that I liked it. It was a lot of work.
You like anything that's tough, huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I enjoyed it. But at the end of 30 days, I went back to Erie, and the first sergeant said to me, "Well, Duratz, how'd you like Meadville?" I said, "I'd go back anytime, Sarge." He said, "Well, don't unpack." Same day, right back to Meadville. I never went to another substation. I stayed there.
For how long?
I was there for 2 years. And there was a little college in Meadville called Allegheny College, and every time I drove by that, I thought, now that's where I should be. So I resigned at Meadville and went to college. But in the meantime, I had met Helene.
You met her while you were still a state trooper, huh?
Yes. And
Helene being Helene Barco Duratz.
That's right. She was George Barco's daughter and Yolanda's sister. And the house was next door to the barracks.
For the record, these are names that are legendary in cable television in the state of Pennsylvania, and as a matter of fact, nationally, because both of them were very much involved in the National Cable Television Association also. So I just wanted to bring that in as a reference.
Well, this was 1950, I guess. And this was before cable, before they even had the cable in Meadville. So I decided I was going to resign and go to college, and I did. There were a lot of things happening during the college time, but...
Didn't get in trouble, did you?
Pardon me?
You didn't get in trouble, did you?
Yeah, a couple times.
Okay. But I won't go into it, but I just knowing you, I imagined you did.
I kept myself busy. But anyway, in the meantime, I was starting dating Helene, and we got pretty serious. And I don't think George liked the idea of my not having a college education. So I had sort of vowed to myself that I wouldn't get married until I finished college. So I did it in 2.5 years. And we finished because they never stopped, I went straight through. Finished about the 8th or 9th of July, and we got married on the 28th.
Oh, that's quick.
And then, actually, I went to work for Westinghouse in Pittsburgh after I got out of college.
Still living in Meadville, though, is that right?
No, we moved to Pittsburgh, and of course every weekend it was a trip back to Meadville, but then they started this cable television business, and
were you involved in it from the beginning?
No. No, I wasn't really.
In the concept stage, though, were you? Family discussions and things like that?
Yes, that type of thing. But I still was working with Westinghouse, and it got to a point where.
What was Barco's thinking about the development of cable in Meadville?
Oh, that's an interesting story.
Please tell it.
Yes. George and Yolanda would go to New York City every summer for continuing education classes for the legal profession. And one year they went to New York, and when they checked into the hotel, they said to George,
they were both attorneys, that's correct.
They were both attorneys. Yes. In fact, Helene would go with them occasionally, but she wasn't with them on this trip.
She was a paralegal in their office, was that correct?
George, when he was checking in, they asked him if he would like to have a television in his room because it was $2 extra for the television. He had never seen television before, so he said, yeah, he'd like to see it.
What year was this?
Oh, it must have been, I would guess, like 1952, something like that.
Early 50s.
One or two. Because it started developing shortly after that, when I tell you the story. So when he got home from the class, got to the hotel from the class that first day, he couldn't wait to turn the television on, and we turned it on, it didn't work. Couldn't get in.
At the hotel in New York?
At the hotel, okay. Didn't work. Now, he was paying $2 to get television, and he wanted to see it. So he calls the desk, and the next thing you know, that they had people in his room trying to find out what the trouble was. And to make a long story short, the next day, it was an RCA system. He had the president of the RCA, who installed that, in his room trying to explain to him why it wasn't working. And then he finally got it to work, and he saw television. So during that discussion, he asked this fellow who was in the room with him, if this can work in a hotel, why can't it work in the town?
And was Meadville getting any signal at all at that time?
Nothing.
There was no television in Meadville at all?
No. Well, up on the hills you could get, there was one station in Erie, and as a matter of fact, Pittsburgh only had one. It was the Dumont Channel 3 in Pittsburgh.
KDX, KDAX?
I don't know. I don't remember that. But it's now Channel 2 KDK, but that was the only station in Pittsburgh. And Erie only had one. It was an NBC that Erie had. And Cleveland, I think, had two at the time. They could get a signal on the hilltops, but you could get nothing downtown. And so the guy told me, he said, well, as a matter of fact, there's a fellow in Pennsylvania starting to do this kind of thing for communities. His name is Milton Schaap, and it's Gerald Electronics. That next week when he got back, he was in Philadelphia meeting with Gerald, with Milt Schaap. And that's how it developed. And by 1953, well, I guess, by 1952 is when they started. And everything was Gerald at the time.
There's a question, though, in my mind about that, and I think it's of interest. Gerald was developing cable television in Pennsylvania and elsewhere.
Yeah.
They would provide financing, manufacturers' financing for the development of systems, but they would always take a percentage interest in those systems.
Yeah,
did that happen in Meadville?
No, George didn't do that.
I was wondering why he didn't do that. That's the question.
No, he saw right away that wasn't the best way to go. Because
a lot of people felt that way after a while.
It's interesting, too, because one of his clients was a doctor, Dr. Winslow. And knowing George can talk somebody into anything, he talked Dr. Winslow to go with him as part of the corporation.
As an equity partner?
Because he was also a president of the bank.
Just thinking, wasn't he?
and he also was president of the telephone company. So you had to attach to the poles, and you had to get the money. So he had this guy who could provide that. And
so he had local financing, the local bank financed the system then,
right.
Is that correct?
And
how much of his own money did he put into it?
Well, I can't, I don't remember what that was, but anyway, the doctor, after they start building the system, it started to cost more than they had thought. And the doctor said to George, I better get out, it's too much money. And so George had to take care of him. And that's how George became the sole owner.
And so he bought the doctor out, or did he buy the bank out at that time?
Well, he just took over the responsibility of the bank alone. And then Yolanda was already involved in it too, but it was then, now there's the two of them. And in fact, Yolanda was the first general manager. And that's where I start coming into the picture. I had a nice job with Westinghouse. I really didn't want to leave Westinghouse, but it got to a point where I saw that Helene wanted to be back in Meadville. And
what were you doing for Westinghouse?
I was a kind of a troubleshooter. When there was a problem, for example, there was a problem with the washer, Westinghouse washer. I had to go investigate it and to bring the problem back. And problem with the handle on the iron, that was a problem. I had to find this lady and find out what the problem was. And there was a little parting line under there that was bothering their fingers. And so
you were on the retail level.
Right. But I worked at East Pittsburgh, where all this was manufactured. And I'd just go out and find out what the problem was and come back and get together with the engineers and try to correct the problem. And I enjoyed it. I covered all the Westinghouse plants, I guess, east of the Mississippi.
So George talked you in, and George and Helene talked you in back to Meadville, huh?
We came home one weekend and we were talking about it as a family. And I thought about it a little bit. I thought, oh, let's give it a shot. Can't. But by that,
you weren't really confident though that this idea was going to work.
That was like digging an oil well. It's just, or a gold mine even.
And what year was this?
Just, I think that was in 1958, 59, and I think they had. I think it was around 9,000 subscribers at the time.
They already had 9,000.
It's interesting, and I tell people this story. We started with 3 channels, and when they started the 3 channels, I mean, it was more excitement than anything that ever happened in Meadville. We went to 20 channels, nobody got too excited about it. But those 3 channels.
Tell me about the excitement.
Because they had nothing.
And how did the excitement manifest itself?
Well, they leased this auditorium from the Catholic school, and they had the dealers bring their television sets in, and they had them on display. And in fact, the dealers had promotions going that it was $125 to get connected and $350 a month for 3 channels.
And by this time, though, the dealers weren't able to sell any televisions in Meadville.
As a matter of fact, some of them had to call other places to get television sets. They didn't have any because they couldn't sell them.
So they were big backers.
They were selling a few, but not too
They were
many.
big backers then.
They started promoting it and said, well, we'll pay for the $125. If you buy a television set, we'll pay so many months. They did a promotion together with the cable company and their store. Well, it went crazy. They had lines of people just signing up.
You weren't involved at this time, though.
Well, by then I was helping them.
Okay.
That's why I say I wasn't really officially working then, but I was helping them. And another instance, I see now, I see advertised where the cable companies are buying back dishes.
Yeah.
We were buying back antennas.
Antennas, right.
Tons of them. We kept the scrapyards, kept their bins full with antennas and pipes that were holding the antennas up. But we did that way back then. But anyway,
Would you trade the whole $125 for an antenna, or only a portion of it?
Oh, to the whole thing, and we'd take them down. In fact, taking them down got to be more expensive than anything, because some of them were pretty high, but we had bucket trucks and ladder trucks, and we got them down. But it worked. It really, and all of a sudden you see the the housetops looking better. The whole town started looking better, and we promoted that appearance thing too.
So how many homes did they pass when they had 9,000 subscribers, and what was your penetration rate?
You know, Jim, we didn't think about that. I couldn't tell you. Nobody thought about going counting the houses, because in fact, we'd build it down the street and sell that street.
Collect the money,
so we could get the money to build the next street.
Uh-huh.
That's how, once it got started. And then when I came to the company, we really started promoting that. And I would go out and I'd go down the street and knock on the doors and tell them we're coming down, pass little pamphlets out, and that worked.
You probably, got 8 out of 10 as you went down the street? Or?
Oh, yeah. It was, especially in the low part of town. It was Jim, I had people offering me money under the table to get ahead in the line. Now, I wouldn't do that, of course, No,
of course you wouldn't do that. Unless they were your friend.
Yeah. Or a lot of them are your friends, and come on, you got to do something. But it was so much excitement about those 3 channels, and that always interested me.
And they were the 3 networks?
Yes. We one out of Erie, one out of Pittsburgh, and one out of Cleveland. And there were 3 networks, and that was it. And in fact, if you remember that you had to go 2, 4, and 6, you couldn't put adjacent channels in because they would interfere with each other.
And you weren't using broadband amplifiers then in the early days? Strip.
One amplifier for each channel.
Yeah, strip for each channel as you went in each amplifier location.
And they had no filters on them, so you couldn't put them together. The first broadband amplifier was 5 channels.
Yeah.
That was it.
And so you were using the Gerald strips at each amplifier location.
Meadville was always Gerald, until then we got some later on when Bruce Merrill's company, Amico. We used some of his later on in some Scientific Atlanta. Once we started expanding out.
Were you Secor, though, another Pennsylvania company?
Yes. Well, as a matter of fact, just before we sold, I was designing the rebuild of the whole system, and that would have been Secor.
Were you doing the engineering also for the system?
Pretty much so. And then, well, we had another fellow who was really the designer, and we worked together on it. And that was Wes Keeble. And I'm going to get him one of these days to
do one of these?
Yes.
Great. When did you go from 3 channels to what was your next step? 5?
The next step was 5.
And you went to a broadband amplifiers.
Let's see, we started in 53. About 1955. It was a couple of years at 3 channels. But that didn't stay very long, because, as I say, that was the broadband amplifier then. But by then, things had geared up in the manufacturing. That was another thing about George Barco, was that, in fact, every time Milt Chap would see me, he said, "Keep George away from me, because all he wants is more channels." Every time we'd see him.
Well, Chap and his people didn't believe that the broadband amplifiers would work in the early days, isn't that right?
No. As a matter of fact...
Isn't that true?
Well, it was interesting that most of the development that Gerald created was field tested by us. When we'd get something, you never knew it was going to work. You have to put it out in the field and try it and see and make adjustments. And we went from 12 channels to
from 3.
3 to 5, and then 5 to 12.
You had the 2 amplifiers, though, at that point, a high band and low band amplifier.
Right. And also remember, they put in galvanized boxes. They weren't in a housing themselves. You had to put the amplifier in a galvanized box, and that was a pretty difficult installation on a pole. It took a lot of space on the pole to put the box on. But anyway, I think it was when we went to the 12 channels. The 12 channels tube was next. Then it was 12 channels transistors. Okay. And when that 12 channel transistor came about, I think by the time we start putting them up, they weren't working well. Gerald finally sent a young fellow from Philadelphia to Meadville. He was there for 6 months making the modification. I think something like 30 modifications on the amplifier.
Wasn't the original transistor, didn't it have transistors only on the input and tubes on the output?
That's when it first started, right.
Gerald had that type of amplifier also.
But I guess that's why they call us pioneers, because you really were.
You were, no question.
Actually, and we didn't complain about having to modify. We knew that what we were doing was going in the right direction, and sometimes it became a challenge to make something work.
Very well.
And even back then, Jim, we had to design our own antennas, and I can remember Jack Beaver from Gerald, who was an antenna man. He'd send you drawings. That's what it should be.
Yeah. Stack them and make sure you got them in the distance. Yeah.
4 stack or 8 stack. Doesn't it's just.
See, the reason I like to go into this in detail is that some years, 50 years down the pike or whatever it's going to be, somebody's going to be looking at this interview, never heard of cable television except what they see on their television set, had no idea of how this began. And you guys that were in the developmental phase.
What you're saying now reminds me of a story that later in our years, a young fellow met me at a social event and was complaining about how bad television was, and this didn't work. And I said, the trouble with you forget about what it was like when you had an antenna. And he said, Jim, I never had an antenna.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So that made me wake up and say, here we're into a generation that really never saw television from an antenna.
That's right.
And now we're in dishes now.
But the fact that we're having these interviews in the archive is going to be for future use by people doing books and scholars and things like that. So
well, there's a lot of pictures around that we've got to start putting these pictures into some kind of a form to show that we picked pictures of the antennas when we built them, and our channel 2 for Meadville were channel 2 wavelengths, 2 big screens. They weighed about a ton apiece. They had to hang on the pole, and that was a big project. Now we have a nice picture of that. The fact that
well, I hope these pictures will someday find their way into the archives at
that's
the center.
What I think is. I think that's something that has to be done so people can see what we had to do.
Jim, I don't want to go into great technical detail, but I have a big question. George Barco was always a firm advocate of the cable system only as a master antenna system to receive signals. And for whatever reason, and I had thought it was for copyright purposes and others, but yet you were the first ones to develop or one of the very first ones to develop an extensive programming on the local level. Is this a dichotomy, or is it what happened that made this work?
Well,
because he was always opposed to any kind of local programming.
First, I think the reason he was opposed to he had a terrific legal mind. He had no technical mind at all about how things work, but legally he was very good at it, and I think he worried about copyright right from the beginning.
I think he did too.
And he was felt very strongly about that. And later on, he was part of that copyright settlement, and it was a thing that bothered him. But the reason we initially got involved with cable casting, we called it then, is that he wanted it for education, He felt very strongly.
In what way? The local schools, or to bring other programming in, for,
Right.
or what?
Well, to be able to, I guess, the legal education stuff that he was doing, he thought that there was an opportunity. They had to go to New York City. He said, why can't we get a tape and show it in Meadville? But it never developed, Jim. Even the schools. He said, "Well, let's try it with the schools." We tried everything to get the education into the cable.
In the meantime, you'd made quite an expenditure in buying all of this equipment for the studios, hadn't you? You had to have $50,000 or more involved in it this time, maybe 100.
Right. And in fact, we even one of the reasons we built a building. We built a building just for the cable company, for the offices and for the service department. But on the second floor, we built a television studio, that was really at that time better than any studio that the television stations had in our area. In fact, one of the engineers from one of the Erie.
And when you say your area, what do you mean?
In the Erie
area,
television area. And one of the fellows from one of the stations in Erie, the UHF station, was a good friend of mine, and he helped a lot. Helped us. In fact, we bought a lot of their used black and white equipment, because we started with black and white, no color. And
big, huge cameras and the
right.
film chains, the big film chains.
The tape machines are 1-inch or 2-inch machines, and heavy. You couldn't move them around too well. But it was quite interesting. And in fact, Jim Strickler is still around. He was the first manager of the cable of the programming, and we're going to do a little session with him too.
Okay.
And because he started it.
Now, had you viewed local programming in any other system at the time you got into it?
No.
There were very few, I know, going on, if any at all.
We had heard about it, but we just knew we could do it. I had a pretty good relationship with a couple of the Erie stations, and we talked about it a lot. And at first, even they thought it wouldn't be a bad idea to get some coverage of some kind in your own little town. It was never, the town itself couldn't support a television station. And I guess George, it was not a moneymaker. In fact, we lost money for a long time with it, but that wasn't his concern.
When did you start selling spots or start selling programming?
Never did.
Never did?
Never did.
You had to lose then.
Yeah, you never did.
They're not today? They're not selling ads?
Yeah, they are now.
Okay.
And a lot of the automatic stuff now. We didn't have that. You remember the weather station that had the camera that went like this?
Yeah.
That pretty much gave us the idea that if you stood in front of that camera, people could see you. And they said, well, why don't we? In fact, that just reminded me. Jim Strickler and I, he worked for the radio station. He was a school teacher, and then he became a manager of the radio station. And then he worked for the power company, and that's how I got to know him. And I was talking to him one day about it. So I've heard Moab, Utah.
Yeah.
He and I flew out to Moab, Utah because we heard about this guy.
Who's the name of the guy that designed it? I know it.
I know his name. I got his name. I just can't think of it right now.
Right now, I should.
But he has since passed away. But he had a man doing
automation.
News.
Automation.
And the interesting, that end panel, you'd take the end panel and put his face in there, and that's
newscast, right?
He was, and they sold it.
Yeah, they used to put ads on it too, little card ads.
Right, they sold it, and it was kind of interesting setup. So we got back from there, and the first program we did was the same way, and we did the election returns.
With your did you do the?
No, Jim Strickler did. I was on the phone getting the numbers from the
and he was
newspaper.
looking through this panel, giving the numbers.
And I was slipping the numbers, and he announced what the vote was. And I was getting that from the newspaper. In fact, I went to slip in the number one time and knocked one of those metal garbage cans over, and we were at the head end. That thing went rolling across the big noise. But and then we thought people liked it. And everybody knew his face, and so that's when our first studio was in the second floor of the YMCA. In fact, every time somebody used a diving board, you'd hear it downstairs. And then that's when we decided it was going pretty well as far as programming. And we had...
What other types of programming did you have?
Had a girl do a little children's show. And then we had...
no clowns, though, huh?
Pardon me?
No clowns?
Yeah.
Did you have any Bozo type show?
Yeah. And a religious group of ministers would come in and had interviews, the people in town.
Well, George and you were always very involved in the infrastructure of Meadville and various organizations and so on. And
right.
You developed that greatly over your tenure there, didn't you?
Yes. And it's shown its effect. It's a nice community, and George felt very strongly about Meadville. He lived there and practiced there.
So did you.
Yes. I ended up being, that was my home. I wasn't originally from Meadville.
So what other program types did you do in the early days, and then as you developed the whole concept?
Oh, gosh. We did, there was a lot of material available on tape, and we did a lot of that. We even did a series of movies, old movies, and our logo was CTV 13, which is an unlucky number, and so we had a cat, black cat, and they did a series of ghost type movies, and that really was pretty popular. And here again, we still didn't sell it. We could have, but we
could have. You had the opportunity to sell it.
We could have, but George was a funny duck as far as money. At budget time, he'd always complain we're not making enough money, but he wouldn't let us raise the rate. He just wanted to keep the rate low, and his idea was that he said you can only spend so much, you only need so much money, why take more? And that was kind of a strange attitude to have in business.
Yes, it is.
But
you had an economics degree, didn't you?
Pardon me?
You had a degree in economics, didn't you?
Yes. Yeah. And I kept telling him, George, we're putting new equipment in, you're expending money. And we were 350 for a long time, even after 12 channels. Then we changed it, I think it was like $24.95, $4.95 a month. But by that time, we're up to 20 channels.
Tell me, when HBO came on, when did you put it in, and did you have a little problem philosophically with putting HBO on the system?
Well, we didn't put HBO on first. We put Showtime on first, okay, because, quote unquote, they were a little cleaner. They didn't...
Well, the smut and stuff like that, okay.
And that was one of George's problems, too. And I guess all of them. I shouldn't blame George for that, too. We were all pretty conservative people, and we thought we'd get some trouble from the church, a lot of church community in Meadville. But then we later on put HBO on.
Well, when you put Showtime on,
it was sort of a test to put Showtime on, and we didn't have much trouble about it.
Now this totally, though, blew his concept of being only a master antenna system, though, didn't it?
Well, yes, that's right.
And was there a philosophical discussion of what, should we put it on or should we not?
Yes, but there was enough requests for it that, in fact, we just, Yolanda and I especially, sort of talked him into it. Said, let's just try it. And he decided, okay, go ahead. It was interesting. He felt very strongly about something, but it didn't take much to change his mind if you could show him some good argument. And I sort of kept a record of the requests that we got for it. And we had after church on Sunday morning, we had a family meeting every Sunday that we were in town. And that was pretty much, the meeting was talking about what happened the past week, and they always wanted to hear, they both always wanted to hear anything that was unusual that happened in my office, and we talked about that a lot. And any decision that was made at one of those meetings as a group. And
that would be the four of you, yes. George, Yolando, Helene, and yourself, right. Is that right?
And in fact, even George's, my mother-in-law would get involved once in a while, because she had her women friends would. She says, yes, I had some people ask me about it, and why can't we have it, and that type of thing.
Never had the Women Garden Society on the programming?
Oh, yeah.
Ladies' Tea Society and so on.
I guess we eventually interviewed every special person in town, for some reason. That was a lot of the programming, just interviewing.
George and you, I think, also were responsible for the building of the Pennsylvania Net, the PennNet Inc. Tell me about that.
That started out as Panorama. And this was George and Joe Gans, Sr. Joe Gans was doing something, and here again, Joe was doing something with a college out in the eastern part of the state. And
they had a microwave system, didn't they, going?
Well, Joe had his own little system going. He had some microwave going, and he was telling George about it, George Barco about it. And so George said, why don't we get a group, that's a wonderful idea, why don't we get a group of people together and finance a network and cover the whole state? And it was 11 companies initially that George got money from, 11 different companies.
Do you remember who they were?
I can't name them all now, but I have that list. I think
that would be interesting, interesting addendum to this.
I have that list in my office, but I can remember. There was TCI, Armstrong, Reinhardt's group, Blue Ridge, Bob Tarleton, Joe Gans, and Meadville.
What year was this?
See, I know you're going to ask me all those dates, and I can't remember the dates.
You know, generally speaking, mid-'60s, early '70s?
It would be about 25 years ago.
Okay, mid-'70s.
We had a 20th anniversary. It's 4 or 5 years ago.
ATC was involved in Pennsylvania at that time. Were they part of that group also?
No. TCI was, though.
TCI was.
And that's pretty much covered most of them. There's a couple I can't think of right now, but I have that list in my office. But
so how did it develop?
They built. That's when they started building the microwave system. And Gans' idea was to use the head ends of cable companies. There's enough cable companies spread around the state that we can use their head ends and their towers, and put the dishes on their, but it didn't work that way. Once you start laying it out, it ended up we called it a figure eight, and Penn State was the center of that figure eight.
You made a big noise about developing this whole network, but it never worked. Is that right?
Yeah, it worked. It worked. Eventually, we built the network. We built the microwave network.
Okay. What did it do?
Pardon me?
What did it do?
Well,
what kind of programming did it handle?
That's right. We had Penn programming. It was Panorama from Penn State, and it was all education. And
continuing education, or what?
And you could take a course for credit. If that was the general consensus, that we would make it available For people who can't afford to go to college, they could do it at home. But that didn't work. Surprisingly enough, that did not work. But then Brian Lockman came with us and just sort of changed our philosophy about programming, and that started working then.
What kind of programming did you go to?
What do you call it?
What types of programming?
Sort of a public service type programming. And now we're into that pretty strong. And here again, still not selling anything.
And it goes into all of the systems in the state? Or those that want to participate?
Yeah. People who wanted to receive the signal would pay per subscriber, like in other networks. And that worked pretty well. And now we had a lot of problems with the microwave system that we had the maintenance on it was pretty strong and keeping it going. And it was initially designed to go in two directions. That's why with the figure 8 big. But then changes in technology came about with compression, digital, and we finally were able to put it on the satellite.
Well, you are on the satellite. That was going to be my next question.
And because of the compression, we had to buy less bandwidth, and it became feasible to put it on the satellite, and that's working very nicely now. And I think we can consider it successful now.
Great. You're still on the board then, aren't you? Of
Yes.
PennNet. What other boards are you currently involved in?
Oh, you mean just other than cable?
Yes.
Oh, it's quite a few.
Give me some. They're almost all Meadville, except for some of the statewide associations, aren't they?
Yeah, I do a lot with the University of Pittsburgh in the athletic department. I'm now on the board trustee at the Gannon University out of Erie.
And congratulations, doctor. I heard you got your honorary law degree.
Yeah.
Yes.
In fact, I said to him, they must think I'm a lawyer. I better tell them I'm not.
Now you're a doctor.
But it's interesting, and I do a lot of. I still do a lot of local stuff in Meadville itself. I'm on the Chamber of Commerce and Redevelopment Authority and that type of thing, and I still stay very active. I still have an office, although everybody's gone now except me, and I still maintain that. And I want to keep the name as long as we can, and that's my goal.
Do they still call it the Meadville Master Antenna System, or have they changed it to Armstrong?
Armstrong changed the name now. It's part of Armstrong group of companies now, but most people still call it Master Antenna. MMA. That's still, and they still think I'm involved in it. And I get
still get the calls and everything like that. You left there, what, in '89? Or it was after '89? So you've been gone 12 years.
Yes.
And you still.
Well, I left there, but I was involved with the network. I volunteered for that job, and I never lost it.
I know how those things work.
Yeah, the fellow who was doing the work that I started doing died, and he needed somebody to fill in for him. And I told Yolanda that I would, until they found somebody, I would do it as a favor. Well, they never did find anybody, and so I stayed with it, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed working with the network. And
you're president of the Barco Duratz Foundation now,
yes.
too. Tell me about that, and what does it do?
Well, it was. Here again, George Barco and Yolanda too, I guess all of us felt that you were successful in the community and you should make some arrangements to return something to the community. And I really don't think there's anybody that's done any more for Meadville than George and his family, in just Meadville. But then we still felt strongly about education and scholarships to help. It's kind of and I don't say this to make one group look different or not as good as another group, but our philosophy was that the kid whose father was successful and had money could afford him to go to college, he didn't need any help. And the guy way down on the bottom could get help through the government in most cases. The guy we were looking to help was the guy in the middle. Family, hardworking families, but just didn't have enough to get that son or daughter to college. But yet they were good students. And we felt very strongly about grades. We wouldn't help somebody that didn't have, just to get them through college. They had to have good grades. Anytime somebody would come in and send an application in, the first thing he'd look at was their grades. And so we helped quite a few youngsters go to college that way.
And we're still doing that. That's the primary function of the foundation then.
Right. And there are certain guidelines that they have to go through,
And you administer this thing?
I'm the president, but we now, since I'm alone, I've turned it over to the bank, and I have 4 trustees. But they call me the master trustee.
The master trustee, yeah. Okay.
And so
now you're not only a doctor, but you're a master trustee.
Right. And everything.
Who's this guy? I thought I knew, huh?
Everything that they decide has to be okayed by me. But they're 4 good guys, and we haven't been too wrong yet.
Do you take their money on the golf course?
Well, usually I'm paying. I'm not good enough to take it, but once in a while I get them.
Okay. Of the 30, give or take a few years, that you were manager of the system, what were you most proud of?
Oh, I think you mean the decision we made I think the decision of changing everything to aluminum cable was the biggest thing I've ever done, and that was, Jim, that was really almost a mistake, the way it happened. And I don't know whether you remember that the University of Wisconsin had a...
Very much so. That's where we first met.
Right.
1960 or 61.
Yeah. And it was, we went there for a week or 10 days, and the last day we were there, and that's where I met Bud Shepard. And
from Canada.
From Vancouver. Mm-hmm. And I liked him. And I think we got along very nicely.
He's a great loss.
Yeah.
Fine guy. And
on our way to the airport, I had already ordered the cable from Times, flat braided.
Flat braid. Mm-hmm.
And on the way to the airport, he was telling me about this aluminum cable. Now, the only thing we had in the United States at the time was Prodon made a 1/2-inch piece of aluminum cable, but that was it. And he was telling me about this 3/4-inch trunk line cable. 3/4 inch, that's like a pipe. But it was being made in Canada. So I said, well, how do you put a tap in? He said, well, just a pressure tap, it's like you do now, into a 412 for the feeder line. I said, why don't you send me a sample? And so right away, I got the sample.
I want to put Bud in a little bit in perspective. Bud Shepard was the president. No, I guess Sid Welch was the president. Yeah. Bud was vice president, general manager of the Vancouver, Canada cable television system, which expanded into become what? Empire, was that the name of the company?
Yes.
Big operaters in Canada.
They were big in Canada. And Vancouver is a big city.
Yeah, and they were great guys.
Right. But he was really, I liked him very much. Yes. And I think he liked me too. But we sort of had our philosophy about the same. But he sent me a piece of 3/4-inch cable and a piece of 412 feeder line with a tap in it. And so I got together with our engineer, Wes Keeble, and the next thing you know, we're up in Canada talking to the Canadian wire people. And he came back and called Larry, said, Larry, cancel the order.
You were still pressure tapping it though, huh?
Yeah,
oh.
Yeah.
When did you go do inline taps, pre-tapping?
We never did.
You know, I remember the great controversy in
We never did.
mid-'60s.
But now they have.
Yeah.
But that was after we sold the system. We were still pressure tap when I was still there in '89.
What a controversy that was.
It was big.
Why spend all that money to put those,
Yeah.
to pre-tap it when you're only going to use 50% or whatever?
Right.
In your case, though, you had every home in town, so it didn't make much difference.
Right.
You still pressure tapped right to the end, huh?
Yeah. Well, then when Armstrong bought it, it was about time for a rebuild. As I say, we were already designing. In fact, the system was on paper when we sold, and it was going to be C-Core, and we had the layout all done. But that I think that was the by going to that aluminum cable, I sort of set the trend for the whole thing, and now it's, as you know, everybody's using it now.
You never used any jacketed aluminum cable, though, not in Meadville, it wasn't
Yeah,
necessary.
we did some places, and we did where we buried it too.
Oh, okay, when you buried it, yeah.
And it had that sealing stuff, the goo in it, and we used quite a bit. And then I built the system in California, Pennsylvania, because of there was a chemical plant in the area. All the cable near there was covered because of you looked at the screen doors and you could tell you better do something.
Like Altoona, I remember that very much. They just eat the
Right.
cable right out of the air.
Right.
Yeah.
So well, and you remember all the trouble we had with the plastic cable, with the moisture coming in and water, and that was the other thing, that when we were rebuilding the plant for Meadville with aluminum, there was a section about 4 or 5 miles that we had just put in braided cable. In fact, it was when we were going to the low band and high band, we were putting, it was supposed to be a broadband system, and we put the amplifiers in right where they were, and all of a sudden we couldn't get anything over.
You didn't respace it, and you're saying?
No, we just put them where because it should have reached, but the high band wasn't going through at all, and it turned out that the cable was full of water. Cut the span out in the middle and turn it out like a pipe.
Put a spigot on it to let it out.
So then we took that down and put aluminum in.
Looking back in your career, what was the biggest mistake you made?
None.
Great. God, you're the first guy I've known who's never made a mistake.
No, I suppose. Seriously, Jim, we pretty much thought everything out as far as. I'm not so sure the programming wasn't a mistake, but this was something that George wanted to do, so you can't consider it
Didn't turn out to be a mistake, though.
No, that's right. But initially, for many years, it was not making any money. It was losing.
Were you opposed to it, though, when
Well, not entirely. If it would have worked for the education, and there's no reason why it shouldn't have, except that the school teachers were afraid of it. And that's as blunt as you can put it. They thought they were going to lose their job, which was not any truth to that at all. It was just too bad that they couldn't see that as a tool. And nobody said anything when they brought movies in, why they were afraid of that television. But I think that the interaction scared them, back and forth. And they knew that was coming. I think they sensed that was coming anyway. And that's probably what scared them more than anything. And I can see maybe that would have.
And you only had one major rebuild in the time that you were there, and that was when you went to
three.
Aluminum?
We had
You had three?
Yeah, I was involved with 3 rebuilds.
And you said you had another rebuild on the drawing board when you sold in '89.
That would have been the 4th.
What would that have been, 550 megahertz, or
Yes.
450? 550?
550.
That's a long way from the 3 channels and individual strip amplifiers you started with, huh?
It was, in retrospect, when you look back and think of things that happened, and how the development in 50 years, what happens in the communication field is just tremendous, I think. And look where we are today. And the other thing, too, is that we're past that development stages. Any morning we get a piece of equipment, now you're almost sure it's going to work the way it's supposed to work. And I don't. That's not. I'm not saying anything bad about those guys in the beginning. They were doing what they thought was right, and that's what brought it where it is today, I think.
Armstrong being a utility company, are they planning on instituting telephony in the Meadville system? Do you know?
I don't know, but they're putting fiber in now, and I would guess that that's what they have. They're already in the telephone business.
Yeah, I know they're a telephone company or a utility company.
But they're small companies, but I can't help think they're already in the internet business. So
they don't serve the city of Meadville with telephone, do they?
No,
they serve?
But internet for commercial use only. But when they get all the fiber in, they're going to go to internet for everybody, and I'm pretty sure of that. But they haven't said anything to me about the telephone. But I can't.
You got to believe they're going to go that way.
It's going to be available, and it's their business. And I think that's going to be a very. It's interesting too. You can't help but think that one of these days it is going to be one. It has to.
Oh, I think there's no question.
And that's going to be the big move, because it's awfully close to that now.
It'll be one cable
Yeah.
coming into the home. It's going to carry everything.
And it's kind of interesting that piece of drop cable, how important that becomes.
Isn't that
today.
true? I often remember that when we were going to allow the telephone company to own all that kind of stuff. Or the telephone company wanted to own that entrance into the home. We always said no.
That last piece of cable.
And the converter. It was the other thing we had.
So it's been a fascinating experience. Is the best way I can talk about it. I enjoyed every minute of it. I can't quit now. Everybody says, I thought you were going to retire by now. And what would I do if I retired? You can only play so much golf, but I'm afraid I'm going to miss something. I still get the trade magazines. I still try to read the trade magazines. Not all of them, but I still get 3 or 4 of them. And I enjoy reading about some of my old friends who are still around. But I got to tell you, though, I went to Chicago this last.
Yeah, I didn't make it.
And I know you're not going to believe it, but I spent 3 hours on the floor.
That much time, huh?
Because I was trying to find somebody I
knew. I'm the same way.
Did not find one person in all that time, both vendors and the people who.
Kind of makes you cry, doesn't it? After all.
Oh, I went back to my room. I thought, boy, that's pretty sad. Mm-hmm. And where are they? Now I went to the Pioneer Dinner, and they were all there.
Yeah,
they were there, but I couldn't find anybody else. And I guess that they were a little disappointed about the activity on the floor this year. But and if you remember, Jim, there was a lot of business taken care of.
Oh yeah.
I can remember almost like being at an auction to buy equipment and get bargains. And I remember the time that Gerald showed the head end. The panels were all there, and we were going to the back. There was nothing there.
Yeah.
But we were buying it.
Yeah, everybody's. Well, it was the only thing that there was.
So it's.
Who were other than George? Who were some of the most memorable characters that you met in your experience?
Oh, number one comes to my head is Bill Daniels. I thoroughly enjoyed Bill Daniels. I thought his whole background was very fascinating, and it was just interesting to discuss things with him, and I liked him very much, and I think he liked our family too, and John Walson. I had a lot of good times with him. Joe Gans. Fred Reinhardt. Oh gosh, I went down to Tyler, Texas, to Tubby
Flynn. Yeah.
There was a problem we had, and I can't even remember what the problem was. I flew down there, and he spent some time.
Was Tubby in Tyler, or was he in Arkansas?
No, he was in Tyler. At that time, he was. Okay. That's an interesting point too, that I think's missing, because the companies are getting so big now. But if you remember, we could call the owner of that company, anybody. You always got a return call, or they'd always take the phone call, because we were exchanging problems back and forth. Mm-hmm. I spent a lot of time on the phone with John Regas when we started about the same time, and And I think that's gone now. There's nobody you don't even know who to call.
Oh, I think that's right. I think that's right.
But it was, I think I talked to almost, oh gosh, I can remember Ed Allen and the two brothers out in the, oh gosh, I can't think of their names now. But anytime you had a problem, you'd find somebody else had the same problem.
Weary brothers, you're talking about in Kansas? Bob Weary?
No, Snyder.
Oh, Gene and
Snyder.
Yeah.
They were very nice. And
Gene and Richard.
Right. And nobody ever not helped you. They wanted to talk to you.
Till we got into franchising battles.
Right. Yeah. Well,
did you ever go through any of those?
Not really.
I know you didn't in Meadville, but
no. In fact, it's an interesting thing. Meadville still doesn't pay a franchise fee. And I had the California system, and when I had it, we didn't pay.
California, Pennsylvania.
And Titusville, I had that system. We didn't pay.
How'd you get the franchises? Just go in and ask for them? We'd like to bring television.
Sort of, I guess here again, George, he was very strong about franchising. And
Did you have a franchise in Meadville?
Oh yes,
okay.
Yes. But
some of those early systems didn't have franchises.
No, we didn't start. We didn't start with a franchise. That didn't come along for almost 20 years.
Well, I know why it came along, because you had to have the
right.
Intangible assets to appreciate.
We had I guess you'd call it almost like a certificate that we could put our cable in the rights of ways. That's about all we had. Jim, when they first started in Meadville, everybody laughed. You're not going to be here for a couple of years. The telephone company.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, do whatever you have to, but you're not going to be around very long. And that's the way it was. And it was, I guess, a different attitude then. And we never it wasn't that we had difficulty with either the power company or the telephone company. They were all good friends. I knew them personally, and we worked together very. It was never. But when I went down to California, Pennsylvania, and had to deal with Bell, see, the Meadville telephone company was just a local. Okay. It was the Meadville telephone company.
Is it still?
No, it's Alltel now, but it was just a local one. And you could right from the president, who was the Dr. Winslow, you could write in his office and talk to him about it. But you can't do that now. And when we went down to California and we had to deal with Bell, I had to go through Pittsburgh. But once I met them and once they saw the work we were doing, at first they were tough. Well, they were really tough. But it got to a point after they saw that we meant to do it the right way, and we did it the right way, they sort of backed off. And then I'd call and say, we're going to go down a certain area. And the guy would go, I'd give him the list of polls. He'd go out by himself. I wouldn't have to go with him.
Tell me about some of your bizarre complaints that you'd get from people.
Oh. Well, I'll tell you what good one. You know, during the see, that's another thing. The equipment, everything's more reliable now, and you have battery backups. Yeah. So you don't have these kind of outages. But when a big storm comes through and you lost a head end, that was everything. And my job was always answering that phone and directing the trucks. And one Saturday morning, the whole system went off. And boy, we had two phones. I kept them going. And finally, some girl answered the phone. I answered the phone with some girl, and she was screaming. And she says, "What am I going to do with these kids?" I said, "Why don't you just take them out and drown them?" All of a sudden, it was quiet on the other end, and she started laughing. She says, "You know that?" I said, "Read a book, because we're having trouble." It was a big storm. And I said, "You know, we had a storm." And she sort of apologized. But later on, she came into the office to tell me how shocked she was when I said, "Why don't you just take them out and drown them?"
You got her attention, though.
Yeah. But we were friends. It wasn't. But there, we had the wires were shot with a lot of hunting in our area, and we always had shooting happening. Storms were terrible. we had a lot of trees in Meadville, and anytime the wind blew a little bit, you were out there. Coal. And that was another thing. We extended our lines to another town from Meadville, and got a bad batch of cable.
There were a lot of those. What year was this? Roughly again.
I don't remember, but I have a record of that. It was probably in the early 70s, and cable was pulling apart. Just
at the connectors?
Connectors, yeah, and pulling right out of the connectors. And then it was too short, you had to add a piece. But it was Christmas Day, and there were 2 crews out working. And I said, I got to get these guys some coffee, something. Trying to find a cup of coffee on Christmas Day in Meadville was impossible. And I couldn't understand why nobody was open. So I used to make a little wine, and it looked like black coffee. So I
good old Dago Red.
And I can remember handing a cup of that to one of the guys, and he was shaking. Wow. That was the coffee for that day. But it warmed everybody up, and we didn't drink a lot of it. But it was, you had to make fun out of it, or you'd go crazy. But we didn't. We really, our service crew were always pretty nice kids.
At your peak, how many employees did you have?
Counting the studio too?
Yes.
Probably 30, 35. It was.
And how many were in the studio?
That was up to about a dozen.
Was there that many?
Yeah.
Technicians and directors?
Yeah, they were running the equipment and everything. We had 2 guys who did nothing but maintenance on the equipment. And the equipment had a lot of trouble with the equipment, constantly. Repairing, the stuff would wear out, cleaning the heads on the machines, that type of thing. So we kept guys pretty busy, and because it's interesting how the programming developed, and it's just like what they're doing with PCN now. It's kind of gratifying now when you say, well, I'm connected with PCN and they know who you are. And that, for a long time, didn't happen.
Well, the same thing in the country when you said you were in cable television or you were in community antenna television, they had no idea what it was.
Nobody had any idea. And that's, I think, is a tribute to the people who are in it now. And I think it must make them all feel, it makes me feel good.
I know, I feel the same way. And it's nice to become
and it's nice to be
a part of it.
Recognized as a kind of a leader in an industry.
Because you were.
Yeah, and I'm very proud of that.
You became a pioneer, a national pioneer in '82, didn't you?
Yeah, that's about when it was, yeah. And then I got the state too.
Yeah, I knew you were a state founder. We're starting to wind down now, Jim. Can you think of anything you'd like to add before we wrap this thing up?
Oh, there's probably a million things, Jim, but you go too long at one thing, it gets boring, I guess.
No, it doesn't. Remember, people that'll be looking at this will be putting together a lot of other things. They'll be writing a book about you someday, and so they'll want to know about you, and that's why your whole personality comes across.
I think that the most important thing is that I'm very proud to be part of the whole industry, and I think it's a fine industry. It developed so. We're only talking maybe 50 years, and what has happened in that 50-year period is really phenomenal, I think. I often sit down and think to one of the big excitements to me was when the first time I saw a signal off a satellite. And I was on the telephone talking to a guy in New Jersey, and you don't think about it until you actually see it. Saw that delay. He said, the signal's on its way. And it was a delay. And what, 22,000 miles? Twice. Mm-hmm. And I'm seeing it right here. That was And Jim, the first satellite receive dish we put in was $60,000.
I remember it was $100,000 the first one we put in Jackson, Mississippi.
You had to put a base in. It was 4 feet deep and 12 feet square and reinforced with rebars and copper wire all
10
around.
10 meter, 30 feet.
Oh, jeez. Today you just found a stick in the ground and put it up.
Would you have envisioned this when you first started?
No.
I don't imagine anyone did.
I did envision VHF and UHF being one someday. I just thought there's enough bandwidth there but I never dreamt of 100 channels. I never thought of that kind of a bandwidth. It just never entered my mind that we'd be in or computer stuff. That never ever entered my mind.
250
it did later. But
250 was mind-boggling to me
yes,
when we went to 250.
right. And you'd say, why? What do you want it for? You certainly don't want it for television. It's just too much. But then this other stuff comes along and.
Well, the first thing was radio. It was FM radio, and we had.
Yeah, you remember that? Yeah, sure. 14 channels of FM in the between the two. So it was I thought was fascinating. It was because and we had a nice demand for that. It's surprising with the FM that was pretty popular.
Well, again, because you couldn't get any FM down in the valley there at all. Jim, we're going to wrap this thing up now. We've been going for quite some time. This has been the oral history of James J. Duratz, former general manager and all-around entrepreneur and good guy, and a man of an old friend, a man who has devoted much of his life to community service, both in the city of Meadville and the state of Pennsylvania, and in nationally also. This oral history is part of the oral history program of the National Cable Television Center and Museum, and financed by a grant from the Gustav Hauser Foundation. Jim, thanks very much. It's been a great delight as always.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.